All right. As we start, and I will change my share, but as we start here, I wanted to mention something to you. I want to make sure everybody watching this, whether you're watching it live or whether you're watching it on tape, understands this. All right. Right now, again, I don't ever mean to talk down to people, but when you look right here under C sharp, I mean, this is the book we're going through. I think you know that. That makes sense to everybody. In spring, if you have not yet taken the AWD 1111, or I'm sorry, the AWD 1000 class, which is the Web Development Technologies. So, in other words, if this is your first class that you're in right now, in fall, in spring, you will be taking AWD 1000. In that class, we use two Murach books. Maybe I mentioned this already, but it bears repeating. And in there, what we end up using, the books that we use they're newer books. And the first one is HTML CSS 5th edition. And as you can see in there, we learn HTML and CSS. If you don't know what they are, that's not a problem. The assumption is you don't know what they are. But we go through that, and you'll notice 580 pages. All right. Well, the reason I'm telling you that is when we look through this, 18 chapters, and really, in the first week of class, we pretty much go over the first three chapters. The idea is, in an ideal world, by day 30, we're done with this book. We've gone through this entire text. Now, what does that mean? Well, if you take a look at the end here, the stuff that's here, the how to deploy the users, this stuff, we really don't spend much time on, especially chapter 18. Why? Because in the last 50 days, we go through this book, which is all on JavaScript and jQuery. Now, I don't want to let that throw people because in the past, I've had people say this, well, that's almost 1,300 pages combined, and it is. But that said, we pick and choose what we go over in there. All right. The other reason I wanted to tell you that is then in summer, if you're going through the regular, stuff in here, in summer, you would, I'm not sure what course you'd be taking next, if it would be the AWD 1111 course or the AWD 1115 course. Probably the 1111 course, but the point is this. When we have the advanced C sharp class, we use this book, or at least that's the plan right now. And when you look at it, this book almost exclusively, as you look through here, I'm not going to go through a bit of this, but they almost exclusively talk about using databases. So even though right now we're going into databases and we are going to do a project on them, what you'll notice is we've got a big chapter in here on how to use EF Core. Why does that matter? Because the chapter we're going over today is on EF Core. All right. And I just wanted people to understand that as we make our way through here towards the end of this book, yeah, chapter 19, you're responsible, but the only thing you're responsible for in there is the written test. All right. Because there are no labs, there is no homework for that. Chapter 20, you're not going to be responsible for anything. So you can kind of, for lack of better words, sit back and just watch today. You won't have to worry about doing anything. Now, chapter 21, which we will go over tomorrow. Again, the plan, at least I believe, is you again probably won't be responsible for anything because most of the stuff that we do is done the easiest way, which is what's in chapter 22, which we'll go over on Thursday. So the plan is chapter 20 today, chapter 21 tomorrow, chapter 22 on Thursday. At that point, we're through with the book. And what that means is, what do we have left? Well, we have 3 days next week because of the Thanksgiving break. And then we've got 14 days when we come back. My hope is by next week, we're going to set up the framework for the project that we're going to be working on, and we're going to start working on that project. By no means will we finish it. All right. Now, when you come back, that means there's 14 days. Are we going to spend all 14 days on this project? No. maybe half of them. I don't really know. It's going to depend on how long it takes people to pick up different concepts. But you will have probably at a minimum, I'm guessing right now, that last week that we have class, which is, I think it's like the weekend of the 12th. All right. And that's not that far away. But that particular weekend or week, we probably will be done with everything. So if you have turned in all of your work up until that point, then the only thing that you will have to turn in will be the electronic portfolio that we talked about yesterday. And let's just say by that time, you've got the e-portfolio turned in too. Then you'd be responsible for nothing during that last week. Now, there are people in this class, you know who you are, all right, who are quite a bit behind in here. All right. Now, and here's one of them. That would be your instructor, because I still have some grading to do. All right. The good news for all of you is you have no more hands-on tests in this class. There won't be any more. In lieu of a hands-on test, we're going to do this project that we're going to start on next week. All right. So you will have at a minimum, you will have to do chapter 19, the written test, chapter 22, the written test. We'll see. I looked at the homework yesterday for chapter 20. I went back and reread chapter 20. Then I thought, well, there must be an easier way to explain some of this stuff. So I went online and I literally typed in Microsoft Entity Framework Core for Dummies. And again, I'm not saying you're dummies. I just wanted it with something that had a very simplistic explanation. So I started looking at what was returned here. And the first thing I found was this. And I thought, well, this maybe it'd be good. Entity Framework Core for Beginners. And it's a 5-part series. Actually, it's 6 parts. The whole thing is about an hour long, and it's done by a guy from Microsoft who I watched it last night. And throughout the entire presentation, he says, okay, now this is really simple, and it's not. It's simple if you've been doing it. It's simple if you've been working on database for years. But the stuff in there, we could have gone through the first one. It's not bad. We could have gone through the second one. That's not bad. But then the third one, when it says ASP.NET Core, that's what we do in the AWD1115 class. And I just thought that would do nothing but confuse people. So I said, no, I don't think so. So then I went back and looked at the next one that was in here. All right. And it's not bad. The article is not bad. The stuff that's in here is not bad. And it's also not that old. Literally, it's about what, a year and a half old? But for what we're working on in here, it's not terrible. So I wanted to explain a couple of the things that were in here. This is under learnmicrosoft.com. All right. And they have tons of stuff under learnmicrosoft.com. All right. But it says here that EF Core is a lightweight, extensible, open source, and cross-platform version of the popular entity framework data access technology. True. All right. And it says it can serve as an object relational mapper. Well, what they're saying is, depending on how you use EF Core, you can have a lot of the code written for you. You literally can go in and you can create a very simple relational database management system that will allow you to view data, insert data, update data, and delete data. Sometimes, believe it or not, where you write absolutely no code. Depending on how you set it up, all of the code can be written for you. And you might think, well, that sounds good. That's what we should be doing. The problem is with doing some of that stuff, you have to understand the underlying themes that are in here. Now it says here, data access is performed using a model. Fine. When you are in your second year of classes here and you take AWD1111, which is Data-Driven Web Development 1, and you take AWD1115, which is Data-Driven Web Development 2, we talk about a concept in there that is referred to as model view controller. All right. In fact, I'm having my students basically set up projects that are model view controller projects in the AWD 1111 class now. Why am I telling you this? All right. Because when you see model, basically what you can think of is database. Now, is there more to it than that? The answer is yes. It's not just the database and the data, but typically you also in your model put in the logic that you need to manipulate that database and that data. All right. Then you've got the view, and that's what the user sees. All right. So, what we're writing in the AWD 1111 class right now is we're basically writing programs that are going to return data. All right. And I could show you them right now. It's not going to help any to show you those. All right. And then finally, there's a thing called the controller. The controller is like a traffic cop. So in other words, you sit there and you type in, let's just say as an example, let's say I go out to Amazon.com. All right. And I hit enter. Then what happens is the controller for one or more of the databases grabs that request and it says, what do you want? So let's say that I go in there and I make a search and I'm looking for books on C#. All right. Then what it does is it'll call a database server over here and it'll say, hey, that person is looking for information on C#. It'll find that information and it'll return that information back to the controller. Then the controller is responsible for formatting it in a way that the view can understand it and it can return back to the user the results of that search. All right. And that's the kind of thing that we're working on. What you will work on next semester is basically what you see in blue right now. You're going to work on the view. All right. If we have time, we'll try to write a simple app where we go out and we call something like this and we make all the MVC stuff happen. We typically don't get that far in the first class. All right. But your whole second year, again, when you take AWD 1111 and AWD 1115, that's what it's all about. All right. So in here, they do explain what a model is. And when you do this, there are two ways that you can create one of these models. You can grab an existing database and you can create a model from that. Or, all right, you can sit there and say, you know what? I'm going to just make my own model and then hook a database up to it later. All right. And you might think, well, one is easier than the other. Neither one of them are particularly easy. Neither one of them are particularly hard. But what you're going to see in just about 5 minutes or less, when we transition back to the book, that when you do that, there's a lot of stuff you have to do behind the scenes. And you have to constantly be doing these migrations. And what a migration basically is it says anytime you make changes to the database, you have to update, write out updates for lack of better words. All right. So again, they explain this stuff in here. Then they show how you can do queries. The good news is when you look at this is not very different. It's a little bit, but it's not very different what you see in here from what we looked at last week when we talked about link. In fact, this right here could be rewritten as a link-like statement. All right. So there's a bunch of stuff in here. The other reason I mentioned this to you is in the past, I have had people tell me, man, there's a heck of a lot of stuff in here and I really don't get it. All right. I've actually gone through these things before with students in the AWD 1115 class when it was still called 1112. All right. We've gone through some of these because there are projects in there. The only problem with some of the projects is some of the best ones that are in there are 4 or 5 years old. So some of the ways that you do certain things in there have changed over time and they haven't updated the project. All right. enough of that. I'm just going to shut up now, and we're going to jump into chapter 20, how to use Entity Framework Core. I have no idea how long this particular lecture will take. We'll again, as always, go till about 9. If we're not done, we'll take a break. I don't think we'll be done then, but who knows? All right, we will take a look at some of the examples that are in here as well. All right, so as it says in the chapter, you learn how to typically what's referred to as EF Core, Entity Framework Core. As it says, to use it, you create an entity data model that maps the objects of an application to the database. What does that mean? That means that basically what you end up doing is you end up writing classes, and the fields in the classes that you write will correspond to the fields in the database tables that you create. The reason for that is, as it says here, you can work with those objects instead of the database. And a natural question then would be, that's fine, but why would you want to do that? Why wouldn't you just want to work with the database? Well, you have to kind of realize that, in a way at least, when you're taking this class, and again, this is my opinion, but in a way, you're unique. And what I mean by that is many of the people who work with this stuff on a daily basis are very, very, very good C-sharp programmers who know little to nothing about databases. And if you use something like EF Core, you really don't have to know much of anything about databases because you're using C-sharp classes that are basically what you're going to manipulate rather than manipulating the database. All right, so as you can see how it's broken down, and this is a long chapter. So first they talk about how to create the entity data model. When you do that, there's a bunch of stuff that you have to set up in here. All right, and I'll show you what I mean when we get to that part in the chapter. Then we talk about another way to use link. All right, and it's how to use link to entities. All right, it's going to look similar to what we did last week, but not identical because the syntax for it is different. Then, as it says, we'll go into how to use the entity framework to modify a database. All right. Then we will talk about how to bind controls. And finally, as it says, we'll go through this customer maintenance application. All right. I don't want to sit and read to you. This is kind of an important concept, this object relational mapping. All right. As it says, it lets you map objects of an application to a database. All right, I don't want to read the rest of the stuff in there. You can take a quick look at it yourselves. But again, the idea is when you are working with a database in a computer program, you typically are not going to manipulate the database directly from within your program. All right, quite often you will use something, as they say here, like an ORM to do it for you. Now, the good news, when you use the EF, you use queries to retrieve data, and you know how to write queries. The queries that you write won't look the same. In fact, many of these are going to look like a combination of what you learned a couple weeks ago and what you learned with Link last week. Some of them will look even different than that. But as it says here, and they're going to show you a picture on the next page, this EF sits between your application and the database. It's important. Again, I don't want to read, but this is the key to it. It translates queries into a form that the database understands. And as it says, it translates the data that's returned so that you can use them inside of C-sharp classes and the objects that you create from those classes. Also, as it says there, it tracks any changes that have been made. So if you make updates, the updates will immediately be seen, which is what you'd want to have happen. You know, much like, and I'm not going to do this, but if I went out to Amazon right now and I was searching for C-sharp books and it said that there was only one book, all right, that there was only one book available of this, one copy of the one I wanted, all right, it's maybe you've seen those, you better buy it soon. All right, let's say I don't. And now I come back this afternoon and I decide I want it and it's gone. Well, somebody else bought it. That should make sense. And their database has been updated. That's what you want to have happen. All right. So it says once you create one of these models, you can query the data in different ways. They will talk about these in here. We will get into link to entities. All right. It says also you can use entity SQL. All right. So it says it works by using a dialect of SQL, not specific to the database. You can also use query builder methods. This chapter basically talks about using the link to entities. All right. It says it is important to understand here that the EF is abstracted away the details. What does that mean? It means exactly what I said to you earlier, in that what they're saying here is you don't need to understand underlying database terminology, technology, the way that you do things in order to be able to use it. All right. Why? Because as they mentioned here, you set mappings up. It says you don't need to consider how the data source is configured. All right. So here's a picture, and I'm not going to sit there and read anything to you from here. All right. What in this chapter, all right, we're talking all about the entity framework. In the next chapter, we talk more about ADO.net. So that's what'll be on tap for tomorrow. All right. So again, they tell you that there's 3 ways. I'm not going to read a bit of this. You can take a quick look yourselves. All right. We'll look at some of those query builder methods tomorrow as well. All right. So again, you constantly see things like provides a layer, abstracts things away, etc. All right. So here's where it gets to be a little bit hinky, for lack of better words. It says before you can use it, you need to manually add it to your project. What does that mean? That means that what you do, let me bring up here. Let me just start up. I'm going to make a garbage project. We don't have to worry about what it is. We're not going to do anything with this project. So let's create a new project. I will very quickly here, because I don't want to waste anybody's time, make a thing here that just says DB project. All right. And I spelled it wrong. Isn't that nice? DBPROJACT. There we go. All right. So I've got this folder called DB project. If I just even make a console app, it doesn't matter. All right. But I want a console app for .NET. So let's type in console here. Oh, there it is. Console app.NET framework. All right. So I bring that up. And again, we'll just call it test project. All right. And we'll call this test solution. All right. And we'll put it on our desktop in this thing that we just created here. At least I tried to, DB project. So there it is. All right. And then I click create. Now, nothing new here. We've looked at this before. You have learned how to create both classes in here and you've learned how to create console apps. But one thing we have not done before is to go into here, and there is stuff that you can put in here. Right now it says error list. If I close that, oh, I didn't want to close it like that. Let's look in the book and let's see how they show how to bring this up. This stuff that you end up adding here says that you were going to use the NuGet package manager with the EF core package selected. All right. What the heck does that mean? That means you have to manually bring this stuff into your program. And what I wanted to show you and didn't do a very good job of was, let's see if we go to view. All right, output. I don't remember which one of these it is, but literally you have to go in here and you have to search for this stuff. So in other words, this information that you use with the entity framework is not provided for you by default. And the reason that it's not provided by default is some of it, at least, is kind of large. And if you're not doing anything with databases, you don't need it. So you come in there, and as it says, this, you have to use what's called this NuGet package manager. All right. And when you do that, you come into here, you can click browse. All right. But typically you come in here and you type in Microsoft Entity Framework Core, period, just that. And you click browse and it'll show you like these three things here. Then you click on one of them and it'll bring it over here and there'll be an install. And boom, now you've installed the first one. Then you come back here and you do it and you install the second one. Then you come back here and you do it again and you install the third one. That's not really that bad when you think about it, as far as adding that stuff. And that's what they talk about here, is how you can add the stuff that you need. And what is that stuff? Notice what it says. It is Microsoft Entity Framework Core.SQL Server. SQL Server is Microsoft's relational database management system. It's Microsoft's version of the MySQL that we worked with. All right. So typically you put in that. Then you put in the Microsoft.Entity Framework Core.SQL Server. All right. And the next one. So we've got the server itself in here. And I don't even remember what that one is and what this one is rather, but there's the core tools that's in here and there's the core proxies. All right. So there's different ways that you can do this, but it's a pain in the butt. All right. When I did this, not online, but when I did this a year ago, I was teaching it in the classroom. And I was constantly walking around to different students who's like, hey, Mr. Scott, this isn't working. Hey, this isn't working. All right. I'm not going to say this is error prone, but the first time or two that you do it, for lack of better words, it's a little bit problematic. All right. And then once you do that and you add that stuff, then, and I mean, when you start looking in here, there's a lot of stuff that you have to worry about. All right, we're going to look at a little bit of the code and you may or may not be surprised. Some of this will be written for you, which is the good news. But it's like anything else. Yeah, it can be written for you, but if you don't understand what's going on, you're still going to be behind the eight ball. All right. So as it says, let's just jump back here. It provides two different web development techniques. This is what I talked to you about before. When you do code first, you write the classes, and then you use the entity framework to create a database based off those classes. You can also, instead of code first, you can use database first. So they're assuming, as it says here, you've already created a database. So you generate the classes from the database. So do you generate the database from the classes? If you do that, it's code first. Or do you generate the classes from the database? If you do that, it's database first. All right. And like I said, we used to spend pretty much a whole week on this. All right. And then we go do a project and we didn't do any of this in the project. I asked people a year ago to go ahead and do at the end of the chapter here, this exercise where we use the entity framework core. We ended up doing it together as a class, and some people almost basically didn't even get it done because no matter what they tried to do, they had nothing but problems with it. All right. So I'm not going to concentrate too much on the stuff that's in here. This is, notice it's a scaffolding. What happens with that is you put in some commands, all right, and the system will go and build a bunch of stuff for you, for lack of better words. All right. So when you start going through this, if you look in here, all right, You've got a models folder, and inside of the models folder, you've got a data layer folder. What's in here again will be a combination of your actual database and the classes that you're going to use for manipulating the database. So in here, if you notice, if you remember from that MMA books, we had a customers class, we had an invoice line items class, we had an invoices class. The context is what we use to kind of tie everything together, but we had an order options, a products, and a states table. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different tables that are in here. In order to get all of this stuff to work and have it make at least a little bit of sense, also, you have to use this file that you see right here, app config. Now, you may or may not realize this, but that file has been in every project we've done so far. Everyone. We just have never done anything with it because of the fact we've never done anything using a database. All right. And all this has got in here is basically what version of the .NET framework we're using. That's it. There's nothing else in here. But there's other stuff that you can put in here. We're going to look at some of that this week and next week. And one of the things that you can put in there is your database configuration. All right. And the reason I'm telling you this is once you do that and you come in here, we're used to coming in here. Let me go back. We're used to coming into here and having our toolbox. We don't see a toolbox now because this is a console app. You already know that. But if I go back to view, one of the things that's in here, or a couple of them, notice there's also something in here that says Server Explorer. And what that shows are basically all of the different databases that we have here. All right. And I don't have very much stuff in here. All right. We're going to talk about that a little bit and in more depth and breadth of coverage when we get into our project starting next week. All right. Again, I don't want to read this because I don't want to confuse anybody more than I possibly already have. All right. So it says figure 25 shows the class that was generated for the MMA books database. The good news is, since it was generated, we didn't have to write this. All right. And I think that if I spent any time going through this, I'd probably make your head start spinning. Really. All right. What you're going to notice is you see the using statement up there. All right. Using Microsoft.Entity Framework Core. You need that in order to be able to work with all of this stuff. All right. But what it's showing basically is how it is setting things up in here. All right. So as it says down here, and like I said, my goal was to just go over this with you for completeness, not to sit there and spend loads of time on anything that's in the chapter. But as it says, the DB context class provides for communicating with the database. Again, keep in mind the idea that what we want to do is we want to go in and be able to use C# classes to manipulate our database. And that's what they're talking about in here. Finally, they mention here this navigation property. As it says, it provides a way to define a relationship between two entity types. What's an entity? For lack of better words, it's a table. All right. We were working with entities in the database that we were working with. Now, I've decided that we're going to keep it simple for the project that we're doing. So we're only going to have 2 tables. But I am going to show you after we do that and get it working, hopefully, that we could add additional tables if we wanted to. All right. All right. So then they start breaking it down and they start showing you some of the stuff in here. So this is the code for the customer class. All right. Now, you look at this and it may make sense. It may not make any sense. But let's break down some of this stuff. All right. By default, the system expects that you are going to call your primary key just ID, nothing else, ID. And you're like, well, they didn't do that here. You're right. So if you call it something other than just ID, you have to put this thing on top here that is specifying that this is the primary key. All right. And you're letting it know its name, customer ID, and then you define it down here. So that is the same thing as when we went in to PHP My Admin and we created we created a field called ID. It's the same type of an idea, but again, we're doing it programmatically here. Then notice there's two other fields. There's a name field and there's an address field. And what we have to put in here are the requirements. So we're saying required for both of those. That's the same thing as if we were in a database and we put not null, which means that neither of them can be empty. All right. They're also both strings. So we're letting the system know the maximum length of each string. All right. And personally, I would have reversed this and I would have made the address 100 and the name 50, but they wrote it. There's nothing wrong with what they wrote. All right. Then we come in here and we're basically what we want to do is we want to be able to link together in here. All right. We want to be able to link together in here this customers table with, all right, another table. So we're saying that the foreign key is name of state. I don't expect that to make any sense to you whatsoever. But if we looked at it this way, all right, I'm going to quickly, and I mean, whoops, not that. I'm going to quickly just write something here, just so you see what, and maybe you get it already, maybe you don't. I don't know. But if customer one, we came in here and it was me. All right. And my address was 751 Parr Road, Wentzville, Missouri, 63385. Okay. And then we'll have customer two and we'll have Evan. And I always forget their address, but I think it's like 3113 or something like that. Let's look. $44.31. Okay. All right. So if we had something in here, all right, if we had something in here that, for lack of better words, we're just going to say look like this. All right. And I'm going to move all these over just so you can see what's going on. So this is one field. This is really one field, but we don't want to constantly be typing Missouri in there. We want to put in Mo. All right. Why am I telling you that? Because we're going to have another table someplace that's going to, again, have this, and it'll have something like Alabama, maybe Arkansas. I don't know which state comes first, but Arkansas, and it'll say AK. And then we'll have Alabama, and that'll be AL, etc. All right. Hopefully, at least you get the idea. I don't know if my abbreviations are right or not. I don't care. But what I'm getting to in here, what I'm getting to is what we're trying to do is we're saying, hey, when we put in this, all right, there's what we really mean when we put in Mo is Missouri, but we want to be able to type those in. All right, we don't want to have to type in the state name. We want to type in the abbreviation. All right, so we're linking those two tables together. And that's what they say here. A foreign key property identifies the property that's the primary key in a related class. As it says, it works much like a foreign key constraint in a relational database. Now, I remember giving this lecture, I think it was last year, and I had a student who said, you know what, I kind of get this, but I have a question for you. And they said, why don't they just come up with something where you can literally, rather than having to use C# classes, where you can literally just write queries and whatever without even using these classes. All right. And the answer to that is they're two different pieces of software. All right. There is database software and there's programming software. All right. And what you do with a database in a company as a programmer may be totally different than what somebody else in the same company does with the same database. All right. All right. Let's just keep going. So, how to modify the generated code? Well, again, if it's generated, that means you didn't make it, which means you may want to change it. So, here's that app config that we talked about before. This is bigger than what you saw before. And I'm not even going to talk about this, but I want to talk about this right here. This is where the magic happens. It uses what's called a connection string. So where it says add name equals MMA books, that's the name of our database. We're letting it know with local DB here and this, we are letting it know right there that it's on our machine. And then we're telling the file that we're using in our program that's going to basically hold the database information. All right. Now, the reason I'm telling you this and the reason that that is so important is eventually you're going to change this data source. Right now, you're only going to be testing it on your machine. Once you've tested it on your machine and you're sure that it works, you're going to hook it up because that database, the main database itself, you're only working with a copy. The main database will probably be on some kind of a server someplace in the company. So you'll have to change that from local DB, etc., to where that actual server address is. The other nice thing about this is that what Microsoft has done is they build in some security features right into this. So when you say integrated security equal true, it'll do certain things for you. Like what? Well, typically it'll set a default value so that if you try to log in, and if for some reason, even if you put in a right login, and even if you put in a right password, if you've got to put in those, if you cannot connect to the database within 30 seconds to a minute, they're going to assume that there is something wrong. All right. And basically, it'll drop your connection. And there are other things that are in there as well. But there are some built-in security measures that get put in. All right. So what they're saying in here is part of the way that you can change this stuff is you can go into this app.config file and make changes in there. All right. Okay. All right. Then let's jump into how to use link to entities. So notice to get data from a database when you use this, you can use link to entities. So it says that's what they're going to talk about in here. All right. Now they're going to start small. Again, it's the crawl, walk, run mentality. So they're going to talk about how to retrieve data from just one table. So as it says to do that, you create an instance of this context for your entity data model. And once you do that, then you can use the properties of your C# object to refer to the different fields that are in there. And that's what they're going to say. They're going to give some examples in here. So let's take a look. All right. So this basically is setting up what's referred to as the context. All right. Then what are we doing here? It says a query that stores all the invoices in a variable. What that does right there is it does the equivalent of running a query like select star from invoices. That's kind of what it's doing right there. And it's putting all of the results that are returned, whether there are no invoices, one invoice, or a million invoices. It's putting all that information into a variable that's called invoices. This is also one of those times, as you can notice on here, that you use the var keyword. All right, and you use var because you let the system figure out the type of data that it is. You wouldn't want to put one of the simple data types in here. You wouldn't want to put int or string or whatever, because invoices hold a lot of information. They hold a lot of different values. All right. So when you look in here, well, this doesn't look that bad. A query that gets a single invoice by ID. All right. So you use that context object that you made up here. All right. On invoices, which you had right here. And then there's a where statement. And all this is saying is give me the thing with the invoice with an ID of 33. All right. There should only be one of these. And it looks a little weird here, this first or default. All right. Usually you set this up programmatically that it is supposed to only return one thing. But what if I did this? What if instead of saying I.invoice ID equal 33 or equal, what if I said greater than? Then there could have been multiple things that got returned. By saying the dot first or default, what you're saying is only show me the first one that matches my criteria. All right. And for the default, typically you set it up so either it's going to return null or maybe even send you to an error page, depending on what it is you're trying to do. Now, that isn't bad, but when you look at it this way, here's another way of writing the same query. And I'm always of the mindset you should try to write something that has the smallest amount of code possible. And I think this makes more sense than this does. Now, you may or may not agree, and either way, it's fine. All right. So now we've got another query in here, and notice there's a where clause on here. All right. But it's got, at least conceivably, there's a bunch of invoices that could be returned. And we're asking to return all invoices with a total greater than 250. For each one of those, return the ID, the date, and basically the invoice total material that's in there. All right. And then you come in here, and again, this looks similar, not identical, but it looks similar to some of the stuff that we looked at last week. One of the reasons or ways that this is different is we're combining information there from two different tables where it says a query that joins customer and invoice table. So we are getting the customer ID from the customer table, all right? And we're joining that with the customer ID from the invoice table. Why? Because the customer name is in the customer table, the invoice date and the invoice total are in the invoice table. Quite often when you work with databases like this, you end up segregating out your data into different tables and then having to join them together to get what you want. All right. Hopefully you can see too, as we're going through this, so we haven't gone too far. We've only done about 10 pages. Why I decided not to test you on this or even go through the example that's at the end of the chapter. Now, as we get on later on in the chapter, it's actually going to get easier and not harder when you see some of the stuff that's in here. All right. So it says, in addition to retrieving selected columns using a join, you may want to return all of the columns from two different tables. All right. It says to do that, the application must load, in this case, all of the invoice data and all of the customer data. And it says on the figure we're going to look at in a minute shows you how to do that. But they're going to talk in here about different ways that you can load information. And I'm going to give you my own take on this. They're going to talk in here about eager loading And a little bit later, they're going to talk about something called lazy loading. The big difference between those is when you use eager loading, you load the information as soon as possible, whether you need it at that point or don't need it at that point. You literally load it up right away so that it's ready for you. All right. Now, in a couple minutes, we'll talk about lazy loading, which means it doesn't load the data into memory until it's physically needed. All right. And what's the difference between those? Well, there can be a big difference when you use lazy loading. All right. The program can run a lot faster, but then it will slow down when it has to load the stuff it needs. All right. There it is right there. It says you simply refer to a navigation property. All right. And they give examples of these again. I don't know if you agree with what I'm saying or not, but the stuff that's in here is to try to go through this stuff in one class period and give it its due justice just doesn't make a whole heck of a lot of sense. All right. All right. Then they go into how you can set up lazy loading. I'm not even going to hit on that right now. All right, let's start on this. We'll take a break in about 5 or so minutes. So it says here how to use entity framework to modify a database. All right. Now, what they showed earlier, remember, okay, I've mentioned this name to you before. All right. We have talked in here about the acronym that's CRUD. And CRUD stands for create, read, update, and delete. All right. We haven't done a lot with databases, period, but you have learned how, for example, you can insert records into a table. All right. We've looked at that. In here, you've learned how you can how you can use a select command to grab data. We've actually also, even though there hasn't been much, we've looked a little bit in here on update and on delete. All right, these don't change. That is their name. So this is update. And this is delete. One thing you have to kind of keep in mind is that virtually data is the lifeblood of any organization. All right. I don't know. I may have mentioned this to you guys earlier. I may not have. I typically tell this, it's short. But years ago, I took my students when I was teaching at a college in Wisconsin, I took them on a field trip. And we went to a place, it was only like 15 minutes away. And basically it was a warehouse and they held a lot of, I believe it was health type of equipment. And I talked to the guy, I'll always remember his name's Denny Hanks. And he gave this big shtick and he talked about what they did there, etc. He talked about what the IT people did there, what the programmers did there. And he got done and he said, "Are there any questions?" And I said, "Yeah, I've got one." And I said, "If tomorrow somebody got into your system and either removed all of your database data or just basically mangled it or whatever," I said, "How long could you guys stay in business?" And he said, "That's a really interesting question." He said, "Off the top of my head, I'd say 2 weeks, and then we'd have to shut down." He said, "But let me think about it." We went on and we finished the tour. And when we got done about a half an hour later, he said, "I've thought about your question. I don't think we'd last more than a day or two." He said, "If somebody was able to go in," he said, "we've got millions of dollars outstanding from our different customers. We owe millions of dollars to people we're buying equipment from." And he said, "If we didn't have that data," he said, "I don't know how we would last more than a day or two." So again, the bottom line is databases and data are the lifeblood of an organization. And I'll tell you what, let's take 10 minutes here. Let's take a break. We'll pick it up on how to use EF to modify a database. All right. I don't remember if I said 10 after or quarter after. Are you there, Grant?
You said 10 after, I'm here.
Okay. All right. All right. Okay. So let's pick it up right here. How to use the entity framework to modify a database. Now, again, notice the subheading there. How to insert, update, and delete data. One thing you have to be cognizant of, and we talked about this before, this right here, the select statement or the R in CRUD, you cannot change data when you use the select statement. It is not physically possible. So the only place that you can change data is in an insert or an update or a delete. The reason I mention that is that's why you don't see select right there. All right. So you'll notice in here that there are different methods. Now, it says 3 methods of the DB set class, but the key thing here is they look similar. Update is still update, but insert is now add and delete is now remove. All right. So again, what you're doing is you're running database like commands, but you're running it on class data. All right. So they show something in here where you would add a new entity. So this is just basically, this is not that different from what we've done, but notice what we're doing there. We're creating a new customer object. And when we're doing it, rather than listing the names of the fields and then saying values, we're literally, when we are setting the values for each field, we're putting the field name in there. All right, then we're adding it. And it's not even that different from the modify and from the delete. All right. So again, the ideas are the same in here. All right. Now, one thing to realize is typically when you run commands like this, virtually always when you run either an insert or an update or a delete, or as they call it in here, an add, an update, or remove, what you typically get back is a number. And what I mean by that is if it worked, so if you tried to add a record here, it would return 1, meaning you just inserted 1 record. Same thing here, you modified 1 record. For deletion, if you don't put a where in there, they put a find in here, so they're only going to find 1, but you could return multiple things. Same thing with modify. All right. That's why you need that dot find in there, which works like a where. It means just basically, I think, just to either update the first one you find or delete the first one you find. All right. Also, as they mentioned in there, the save change method saves the pending changes to the database. So you don't see that. You don't see that unless you go in and you bring the database back up. One of the things that's really dangerous about doing some of this stuff, all right, is once we get into this next week and you start seeing stuff over here, is that what you can do is if you have a database in here, all right, typically you're going to see that you're going to have a database file that represents that database in here. All right. And you can go in and in your program make changes to it. Then you can usually bring it up over here and see those changes right away. The reason I'm telling you that, and the reason that that's scary, is what you're going to see next week, hopefully, whenever we start to bring all this stuff together, is that I can go in and change stuff in my program. All right. But I can also go back into PHPMyAdmin and change it there. You really shouldn't be changing stuff while you've got a C# program up and running. You shouldn't, there's nothing wrong with keeping like a PHPMyAdmin or something like that open, but you should be using one of them when you're going to be changing the database and not both of them. And it's not that you can't do it, but it can be very confusing to do it that way. All right. They also talk in here about cascading. All right. And when you've got these foreign key relationships that they talk about in here, you've got a parent table and a child table. What do I mean? Well, think about if I had a table called orders. All right. And in that orders table, I had orders from all my different customers. Well, each order would have different, things that were ordered. So if it was, I don't know, if it was like staples, I might have ordered staplers, I might have ordered, a copy machine. So the point is this: the parent table would be orders, the child table would be order details. Okay. So what do you want to have happen? All right. What do you want to have happen when you let's say that I had this orders table and I had an order detail table. All right. Now I go into the orders table and I attempt to remove an order. Well, if that order hasn't been paid for yet in the order detail table, do I let that be removed? And it's up to you and it's up to the people who end up creating the situation in here. When you've got cascading deletes, what you're saying is if you remove a parent, remove any child records that are connected to that parent. That can be dangerous. Same thing with updates. When you update a parent, it automatically updates the child. There's different ways that you can do this. That's what they're talking about in here. All right. Now, database exceptions. It says, how do you handle that? You're going to have to put a lot of stuff in try-catch blocks and check this. All right. Again, for a lot of different reasons. They say, for example, in there an update exception. What if I had a field that was called, I don't know, amount due, and it was $1,000, and we attempted to go in there and make a change to it. But when we attempted to make a change, we removed the 1,000. We forgot to put anything else in there, and then we attempt to save it. We're going to get some kind of an update exception because it's expecting a number in there, and I put something in that's non-numeric. All right. They give another example in here. What if you tried to add a new row to a table and you're not using, you can use an auto increment type of thing like we looked at in PHP My Admin. But let's say you didn't do that you manually want to put in the primary key, which you can do, but you attempt to put in a primary key that already exists. All right. So there's a lot of ways that you can get different types of database exceptions. So as I said, you typically will end up putting that into try-catch blocks. And it becomes even more important because there's different types of database exceptions that typically at the end, you do a catch where you catch everything. All right. And they talk about that in here again. I've said this to you already. I'm going to keep saying this, that the goal in here is just to introduce you to this stuff. By no means am I saying, yeah, now you're an expert on it. All right. Now, everything that you've been doing so far and everything that we do in this class, you're working on your own machine. You know that already. We brought in PHP My Admin. We brought in XAMPP or XAMPP so we could use PHP My Admin. So you could go in and you could perform CRUD operations on databases. So you could create databases, read information from them, update information in them, delete information in there, insert new information. We've talked about this already. But if you are working on a database where they're like Amazon, for example, all right, then you can have problems with concurrency. With concurrency, two or more users are trying to potentially change the same data or the same record at the same time. And how do you handle that? There are actually different ways of handling it. It depends on the type of concurrency control you're using. Some places actually don't handle it, and it's the last in wins. So in other words, let's say that I work for a health club. All right. And somebody comes in and I don't know, somebody comes in and they come in, they say, I changed my address. We bought a new house. All right. So I bring up the record and I start making changes. Now let's also assume that the same person or somebody else had sent a text saying that they went in and they moved. All right. And they got a new phone number. All right. So while one person on one machine is trying to change the address, another person on another machine for the same record, for the same individual, is trying to change the address and the phone number. So if you do that and you use the last in wins method, whoever saved theirs last, all right, the other person's, you don't even know that it happened. So if that second person didn't save they put in a new phone number, but they didn't put in a new address, now the old address is in there with a new phone number. Well, the other way that you can get around this is you use what's called a locking mechanism. And when you use a locking mechanism, all right, what happens is that basically you can lock things. You can lock an entire database, or you can lock, so you can lock at a database level, meaning if I open up the database, nobody else can. That's pretty extreme. You can lock it at a table level, which means if I open up that table, you can't do anything with the table. That's still pretty extreme. But you can also lock things at a record level, so that if I've got this record up and I'm working on it, nobody else can do anything until I give up ownership of it. And that's pretty much what they talk about in here. All right. So, they give you a scenario. It's not 100% the same or different from what I told you. Okay. All right. So checking for concurrency, yeah, it's pretty important. All right. So once your company gets bigger and bigger, you don't want to use a last in wins. I mean, last in wins, we don't even look at concurrency here. We don't use it because you are all using your machine. But imagine again that if we had one database and everybody in the class was using it, then we could potentially run into problems. All right. So you'll notice concurrency exception. All right. And then there's a regular update exception. And as it says, the concurrency exception is thrown when a concurrency conflict occurs. I went through some of that with you. All right. So it says when you use the entity framework, you can bind controls to an entity collection or the results of a query. It says that's what you'll learn next. All right. And I want to put this in a way that it'll make sense. Let's take a look down here. It says when you bind a control to an entity collection, all the rows and columns are mapped in the database, are retrieved into that context. What the heck does that mean? That means that when you set this stuff up, when you set up a database, and I don't think this is where they're going to show the example, but what you can do, I mean, you know how to build an interface. This is not a GUI program that we've got right here. Okay, we don't have one. You know that. But if we had a GUI program that we wrote, or if we came in here, and let's just say we came over here and we added a new item and we added a form. All right, I'm not going to worry about how it looks or anything else in there. So I just went in and added a new form. All right, one of the things that we've never really looked at in here, when you start going through all the stuff that's in here for the form, is as you start putting in information, there are entities in here that you can put in. So let's go in here. I'm going to click on here. I'm going to go back to my toolbox, just so you see this. And I'm going to put in, let's try a list bar or list box. That should work, I think, for what we want to do here. All right, so I've got this list box. Okay, big deal, right? Well, it sort of is, because when you look in here, and hopefully you can see this on your screen, there's a property here that says data source. And what I can do there is I can link this so that when we get information to put in there, rather than having us go into that items thing that we looked at a lot earlier this semester, where we went in there and in here and manually added things, what if there were hundreds of things to put in there? We wouldn't want to manually add them. That would make no sense. So what we would do instead is we would set up a data source where we could link this to a database and to a particular field in the database. All right. That's when you start to at least hopefully see some of the power in this. We're going to do this, but again, ours is going to be very stripped down, but we're going to do some of this starting next week. All right. So in order to do that, as it says, you end up binding. They used a combo box. It can be anything. The one that we're going to look at next week, the one that we're going to use, and this is chapter 22 in your book. All right, the one that we're going to care about, let me just remove this. All right, is we're going to come in, and so far, we've always been grabbing things from all Windows controls. But we're going to look at the one in here that says data, and we're going to grab a data grid view. And in many ways, not totally, but in many ways, when you go through this, a data grid view is like using a spreadsheet. All right. So we have to tell it where our data source is. In other words, where's the database we're hooking onto? What columns do we want to use in here? All right. Do we want to automatically enable it so that we can add more records, so that we can edit existing records, and so that we can delete existing records? This is all up to the developer. When we create this next week for us, all right, we're going to basically enable all this stuff. Do we want to enable column reordering? So, are we able to go and drag stuff back and forth in here? That's not going to change it in the database. It'll just change it on our screen. So this is the stuff that we're moving towards. All right. And as they say here, oops, you can use bound controls to display, add, modify, and delete data. That's what we're going to be looking at next week. All right. So the last part of the chapter here talks about this customer maintenance application. Okay. So as it says here, it displays the user interface for the customer maintenance application. There are two forms. So let's look. All right. So what do we have here? Well, this is our main form. All right. And I'm not saying what they did is a good way of doing it or a bad way of doing it. It's the way they did it. But if you look in here, you put in a customer ID, and if the customer exists, then you bring up all their information. This information that's in here has been bound to a database. All right. And if there is no number 9, what happens? Well, you can typically you'd set it up so you'd probably be putting up a message box or something in there. All right. Then we've got this. So once you bring up a customer, all right. In fact, let's even go back, take a step back further. All right. So let's say that this comes up and there's nothing in any of these, and this is empty. All right. So what do we want to do? Do we want to get an existing customer? Do we want to add a new customer? Do we want to modify an existing customer? Do we want to delete an existing customer, or do we want to exit? Well, the reason I'm saying this is when it first comes up, if you don't have a customer yet, you should be able to add, but you'd probably want to take the modify, the delete, and the get customer buttons. You'd probably want to disable those. All right. But if you put a value in here, then you want to enable this one, but you want to disable that one and enable this and enable this. So they're expecting in here that you put in 9 and you click get customer and it gave you this information. Then it's expecting after you've had that information, you want to click add. So it's bringing up another form. And you'll notice it has the same 4 fields in it, but for the state, it's got a drop down. And the reason that you would typically do something like that and set that up as a drop down is so you couldn't put in a wrong state. So there very well could be 2 tables in here, one table that's got customer information and another table that has state information. Now, again, in the past, when I've given this lecture, I've had people say, well, couldn't you do that with a zip code too? And the answer is yes. You could have even done it with a city. But think about how many cities there are in California and think about how many zip codes there are in California. I have no idea what the answer is for either one of those, but it would take you typically a lot longer if you made fields like those drop downs than it would be to just key them in yourself. All right. Now you still can come in here, and it's possible that you could come in here and you could you could spell a name wrong or an address or a city or put in a wrong zip code. All right. So either you have to check for that in your code or you have to just be cognizant of the fact that that's possible, period. Now, when you look on here too, we've got get customer and it's got Daryl Rascano. Well, here they've got modify. So we have not clicked new. We didn't click add there. We clicked modify there. I was wrong. And it brought up that existing customer. So you can make changes. Again, if you spelled Daryl's name wrong, put the address in wrong, etc. All right. And then after you do that and you click accept, all right, it's going to write it in unless you put in something like this. But if you click delete, at a minimum, it should come up and say, hey, you're about to delete this person. Is that what you want to do? This is also expecting when you look at this that you're putting names in there, last name, comma, first name. So had you put in there just Daryl Rescano like that, it would have assumed that the last name probably was Daryl. All right. That's why quite often, even though they're not showing this on this example, because it's a fairly simplistic example, you typically would break the name up into first name, last name. All right. Okay. And then they give the code. All right. Well, that should look familiar to you. That is valid data. All right. And this isn't exactly the same as what we did before, but it's pretty darn close. So again, one of the things I like about this book, and not everybody agrees, but one of the things I like about this book is the fact that they tend to show you something and then they tend to use it throughout the book. All right. And again, there's displaying the customer. That isn't really anything new that's in there. Clearing the controls, that's not anything that's new. Add, again, I would have written that as a separate routine, but you should be able to read the majority of this code that's in here, and it should at least make some sense to you. One of the places that I wish they would change in here is I wish when they're bringing in new concepts like this, that they would do a better job of writing in comments. I've talked to some of the people about that and they kind of laugh. And then they say, well, if you look at your C# book, it's 800 pages. Would you rather have more comments in there and have it be 1100 pages? All right. Yeah, I would, but that doesn't mean I'm everybody else. All right. So it's over 4 different pages there. All right. So then they break it down to the add modify customer form. And the idea is, and I mean, you're all smart people in this class, but let me go jump back here for a second. We we are using the same form here basically for adding or for modifying a customer. We are. So if you click add, it's going to bring this up, but it should say add up here. If you click modify, it's going to bring this up, but it's going to say modify in here. All right. Right now, if you look, we are not putting in having anything to do with a primary key. There is nothing in here with an ID. Does that mean there is no ID? Not at all. That means we're not showing the ID. All right. The reason I'm bringing this up is let's suppose this is customer 9 right here. And let's suppose we didn't press modify here. Let's suppose we pressed add and we put in the exact same information. All right. Is it going to take it? The answer is by default, yes. Could there be a Daryl Rescano and a Daryl Rescano Jr. at the same address? I would think so. All right. We could also come in and maybe somebody else lives at this house and has a different last name. etc. All right, so these are all things, as far as what do you have to look at in here. All right. I know that, for example, I order stuff occasionally from Amazon. And when I moved to St. Louis about 7 years ago, a couple years later, one of my daughters moved in with me for a while. We both had Amazon accounts. Now, it wasn't an issue because our names are different, but there were two people with the last name of Scott that had the same address, the same city, the same state, and the same zip code. All right. That said, you wouldn't want to take something there's not a field in here that you would use as a primary key. I don't care what anybody tells you. So if you are going to actually have an ID field, there's really no reason to show it right here. That doesn't mean we cannot show it. That means there really is no reason to show it in here. And if for some reason we decide that we want to actually show the ID, so the customer ID right here, we could do that. But you should always make it a label. Don't even make it a read-only text field. Make it a label, because you should never allow a primary key to be changed. That can just wreak havoc in your database, period. All right. So again, they go through with the code for the add modify customer form, and some of the stuff that's in here, you will understand. It'll make sense to you. Some of the stuff that's in here, you may or may not understand, or you might have to take a look at it, take a read at it, etc. All right, and that's it. Now, before we finish up, a couple things. All right, first thing, let's talk about what we're going to look at tomorrow. How to use ADO.net to write your own data access code. Even ADO, which stands for ActiveX Data Objects, I'm going to very quickly give you a kind of interesting story behind that. It used to be, when I taught this class, when I was at the college I was previous to this, we weren't teaching C#, which is also known as Visual C#. We were teaching visualbasic.net. All right. And what happened there is, when you went to your toolbox and you did something like this, it didn't look like this at all. Literally what you got were about 20 different controls, and you had a little icon picture like this, and they were lined up in 6 or 7 rows. And then every time you wanted to add a new control, you had to go through this song and dance. These were all ActiveX controls. And you had to go in, and there was a way to do it, but you had to go in and add a new ActiveX control. Well, the name stuck. So when you hear ActiveX data object, they're talking about ActiveX. So as it says in here, and I'm not going to do this now, but it said previously we learned the entity framework. All right. And it says when you do that, EF uses ADO.net under the hood. It says in some cases you may want more control over how data for an application is being processed. So much of the stuff that you just saw in there was going to be pre-written for you. All right. And sometimes that's enough. You set it up, boom, everything's cool. But sometimes you want to be able to look under the hood and make some changes in there. And that's what we're going to be talking about then tomorrow. So as you can see in here, quick introduction, connections and commands, but we'll talk about parameters. And guess what? Whether you think so or not, you know what parameters are already. All right. We've talked about how to pass parameters to a function or to a method. It'll be very similar in nature. We'll talk about some of the commands that are in there. And then we will look at this customer maintenance application. All right. So that is the plan then for tomorrow. Then on Thursday, we will go through and talk about a data grid view control. And probably at least historically, people have looked at those and, oh, that's okay, that makes a lot of sense. But we'll spend a little bit of time in here, even though it's only a few pages, on this master detail form. All right, what is it? Why is it? Okay. The idea is if I come up here and I choose a customer, then I come down here, these are two different tables. This is a customers table. This is an invoices table. It's got all the invoices in there, but I've told it that I wanted to ferret out just the invoices for Sarah Cumberland. So what we are going to end up doing when we create our thing, our little Garth Brooks thing that I mentioned to you, is up here, we're going to have 15 entries. And those are all of the albums that I found for him. There are more, but those are the ones we're going to use. We're going to have these buttons in here. This will allow us to move to the first record. So if we had more than 15, like maybe 1500, it would go to record 1. This allows us to go to the last record. So if we had 1500 records, it would allow us to go to record 1500. This moves back a record. This moves forward a record. Typically, and you don't have to do it like this, but quite often what people do is if you're at the end and you click the one to go forward, you just go back to the beginning. If you're at the end and you click the back button, I'm sorry, if you're at the beginning and you click the back button, you go to the end. It's a loop around type of thing. All right. And then we've also got it set up in here. You'll notice there are 70 entries. We see right now 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, looks like 10. All right. And we are in entry 13 of 70. But if we know the page, we can also jump there. But the idea behind a master detail used to be called master slave, but as you guess, it's got the bad connotation to it, as I guess it should. But it's called master detail. This is the master, the customer. This is the detail, the invoices for the customer. Parent table, child table, however you want to look at that. We are going to build something like that. So if you click on this album, for example, then down here, it'll show you the information, but just for that album. So that's the kind of thing we're going to build. All right. So we will go over chapter 21 tomorrow. I'm going to go back and reread it in just a few minutes myself. But my gut feeling is, again, there'll be nothing that's in there that you'll be tested on or anything else. And then tomorrow at this time, once we finish the chapter 21 lecture, I'll do the same thing with chapter 22. So you will know by Thursday what homework you have. At a minimum, it'll be the chapter 19 written test and probably the chapter 22 written test. All right, so if you've got those in on Sunday and you got everything else done, you're all caught up. All right, over the weekend, I'm going to try to build this entire app, see if I can get it up and running, and then we're going to build it together. We are going to build it really, really slowly and deliberately because I want you to understand what's happening along every step of the way. All right, so that's all I have for today. Unless you have any questions, Grant, I will see you tomorrow.
All right. See you tomorrow. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.